The day Hazel Grayson rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico, with nothing but a saddlebag, a loaded pistol, and a heart full of grief. The whole town stopped breathing for just a moment, and Oliver Barlow, leaning against the post of the general store with sawdust still on his boots, felt something shift inside his chest that he would not be able to explain for a very long time. It was the spring of 1874, and Dusty Creek sat at the edge of a wide, amber plain where the wind never really stopped blowing and the sky went on forever in every direction. The town had grown in the years after the war, filling out with a saloon, a blacksmith, a dry goods store, a small church, and a scattering of homes that leaned slightly into the prevailing wind, as if they had been trying to leave for years but never quite managed it. The railroad had passed 20 miles north, which meant Dusty Creek was the kind of place people came to either because they had nowhere better to go or because they were trying to disappear. Hazel Grayson was neither of those things, though anyone watching her that first day might have guessed otherwise. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair pinned loosely beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes that were exactly the color the town was named for, a warm, shifting hazel that looked green in sunlight and gray when clouds moved in. She sat her horse with the easy confidence of a woman who had been riding since she could walk, and she guided the animal, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, through the single main street of town without stopping until she reached the front of the sheriff's office. She dismounted cleanly, tied Copper to the post, and pushed open the door without knocking. Sheriff Tom Briggs was a heavy-set man of 50 with a carefully tended mustache and the permanently tired eyes of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. He looked up from his desk when the door opened, and his eyebrows rose slightly when he saw who had come in. "I'm looking for a man named Dale Prout," Hazel said, without preamble. The sheriff set down his pen. "That's so. He came through here sometime in the last week. He would have had 2 horses with him and possibly a third man. I need to know where he went." Briggs leaned back in his chair and studied her carefully. "And who might you be, coming in here making demands before she has even told me her name?" "Hazel Grayson." "My father was Edward Grayson, who ran the Grayson cattle spread outside of Santa Fe. Dale Prout worked for my father for 3 years before he robbed him, burned our barn to the ground, and left my father with an injury that killed him 6 weeks later." The room went quiet enough that they could both hear the wind outside. Briggs was silent for a moment. "I am sorry about your father, Miss Grayson. I truly am. But I have to tell you that Dale Prout is not someone you want to go looking for on your own." "I have been looking for him on my own for 2 months, Hazel said evenly. "I am not interested in being talked out of it." Briggs sighed, a long, slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of years. "He came through here, yes, stayed 2 nights at the saloon, left heading east toward the canyon country. But Miss Grayson, that is rough land out there, and Prout travels with men who have done worse things than burn barns." "I know what Prout is capable of," she said. "Thank you, Sheriff." She was back out the door before he could say another word. Oliver Barlow had not meant to be listening. He had been sweeping the front step of the general store, which belonged to his uncle, a gruff but kind man named Gerald Barlow, who had been letting Oliver work off his board there, since Oliver had come back from a cattle drive gone wrong 6 months prior, with a healed-over bullet graze on his left arm, and a general feeling that the world was a more complicated place than he had previously imagined. Oliver was 27 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent most of their lives outside, with dark eyes and a slow, careful way of moving that people sometimes mistook for laziness until they saw him work. He had not been eavesdropping, but the sheriff's door was thin and the street was quiet, and he had heard most of what Hazel Grayson said through it. When she came back out and untied her horse, Oliver set down his broom. "Excuse me," he said. She looked at him with a directness that was slightly startling. "Yes. I could not help but hear what you said to the sheriff, about Prout." He held up one hand before she could speak. "I am not trying to stop you. I just want you to know that the canyon country east of here, It is a particular kind of difficult to navigate if you do not know it. There are a lot of ways to get turned around, and Prout knows it, which is exactly why he went that direction. Hazel studied him for a moment. Do you know it, the canyon country? I spent 2 years working cattle drives that ran through it, Oliver said. I know it well enough. She tilted her head slightly. Why are you telling me this? It was a fair question, and Oliver took a moment before answering. Because you are going to go regardless of what anyone tells you, and it seems like a better use of everyone's time if you do not get lost on the way. Something shifted briefly at the corner of her mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was close to one. Are you offering to guide me? I suppose I am, he said, and then paused as if slightly surprised to hear himself say it. She considered that for a moment. I cannot pay you much. I am not asking for much. Another pause. The wind moved through the street, carrying the smell of dust and juniper. Copper shifted her weight against the tie post. My name is Hazel Grayson, she said. Oliver Barlow, he said. I can be ready to ride by early morning if you want to get a decent start before the heat comes up. Sunrise, she said simply, gathered Copper's reins, and walked the horse toward the livery at the end of the street without looking back. Oliver stood there for a moment in the wake of her, and then picked up his broom and went back to sweeping, though his mind was very thoroughly elsewhere. His Uncle Gerald found him in the storeroom that evening, sorting through a delivery of dry goods with the methodical focus of someone trying to keep his hands busy while his thoughts ran loose. Heard you are riding out with a woman in the morning, Gerald said, leaning in the doorway with his arms folded. News travels fast. This is a small town, Oliver. Her name is Hazel Grayson. Her father was killed, Gerald, not directly but as good as. She is going after the man responsible. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He had known Oliver since the boy was 8 years old, and he had a fairly accurate read on him. And you feel the need to help her because she is going to ride into some of the meanest terrain in the territory alone if I do not, Oliver said, and because she is right to go, even if it is dangerous. Gerald nodded slowly. He did not ask any further questions, which was one of the things Oliver had always appreciated about him. Hazel was already at the livery before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Copper saddled and loaded with efficient precision, and she looked at Oliver when he arrived with a single nod that he was learning to interpret as approval, which from Hazel Grayson appeared to be a considerable thing. They rode out of Dusty Creek as the sky went from purple to pale gold, and the land opened up around them like a great exhaled breath. For the first hour, they did not speak much. Oliver had noted this about Hazel already. She was not uncomfortable with silence, and she did not fill it with unnecessary words the way some people did. She rode well, sat her horse with relaxed attention, and watched the land around them with a quality of alertness that told him she had been riding through rough country for long enough that it was second nature. It was Oliver who finally spoke. You said he robbed your father before the fire. Yes, she said. Prout had been managing the books for the spread. My father trusted him because he had come recommended by another rancher in the area whom my father had known for years. Turned out Prout had given that man a false name, and the recommendation was built on nothing but Prout's ability to present himself as respectable. She paused. He took everything from the strongbox in my father's office, nearly 2 years of savings. Then he set the fire, probably to cover his tracks or destroy the records. My father tried to fight the fire himself instead of running for help because he did not want to lose the barn full of horses. She stopped there. Oliver waited. He got the horses out, she said. Every single one of them, but he breathed in too much smoke and his lungs never recovered. The doctor in Santa Fe said there was nothing to be done. He lived 6 weeks after the fire. Oliver did not offer hollow condolences. He had found over the years that people who were in the middle of their grief did not need platitudes, they needed to be heard. I am sorry, he said, and meant it simply. She glanced at him sideways. He was a good man, he did not deserve it. No, Oliver said. He did not. They rode in silence again for a while, but it was a different quality of silence now. Something had been offered and received between them, and the air felt easier. The land around them was changing as they moved east, the flat plain beginning to break and fold into low ridges and scattered mesas, the color shifting from pale gold to deeper ochre and rust. Juniper and pinon grew in the draws, and occasionally a hawk turned slow circles far above them, riding the thermals with magnificent indifference. Oliver led them along a route that kept to the higher ground where the going was firm and the sight lines were good, and he explained his choices as he made them, not talking down to Hazel, but sharing information the way he would with anyone who needed to navigate this country. "You said you ran cattle drives through here," Hazel said at mid-morning, when they had stopped to water the horses at a trickle of a stream that cut through a rocky draw. "2 years," he said. "Before that I worked a ranch outside of Taos. Before that," he paused. "Various things." She looked at him. There was an invitation in it, quiet and without pressure. "I grew up in Kansas," he said. "My parents died when I was 15. Cholera. I went to my Uncle Gerald after that. Worked for him until I was old enough to feel like I needed to make my own way, and then spent several years doing exactly that with varying degrees of success." "The bullet grazed on your arm," she said, and then looked slightly surprised at herself. Oliver glanced at his left arm, where the sleeve of his shirt covered the old scar. He had not thought it was visible. "You noticed that. The way you favor it very slightly when you lift something with your left hand," she said. "I grew up around enough cowboys and ranch hands to notice." "Fair enough," he said. "That was 6 months ago. A cattle drive that went badly when the foreman turned out to have arrangements with a group of rustlers. Things got complicated. I ended up here working for Gerald while my arm finished healing up properly." Hazel was quiet for a moment, watching Copper drink. "You have had a difficult few years." "Not more difficult than a lot of people's," he said, and meant that too. She looked at him then with something that was more than the cool assessment she had given him when they first met. It was thoughtful, almost warm. "I appreciate you coming with me," she said. "I want you to know that I do mean it, even if I did not say it with much grace yesterday." Oliver smiled. It was a slow, genuine thing. "You said what needed saying. That was enough." They pressed on through the afternoon, and the canyon country began in earnest as the sun began its long western descent. The land here was ancient and dramatic, red rock walls rising and plunging, narrow passages opening into broad amphitheaters of stone, shadows pooling in the crevices like dark water. It was beautiful in a way that Oliver never quite got used to, no matter how many times he had ridden through it. They made camp in the shelter of a rock overhang as the light turned amber and the shadows stretched long. Hazel built a fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been camping alone on the trail for weeks, which she had, and Oliver cooked a simple meal of dried beef and beans with coffee so strong it could have stripped paint, which he handed to her with a slight look of apology. "It is how I make it," he said. "I have been told it is an acquired taste." She took a sip, and her expression went through several interesting phases. "That is indeed coffee," she said finally. He laughed, really laughed, a genuine startled sound, and she looked briefly surprised, and then smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her. It changed her whole face, made it something luminous and warm, and Oliver found himself looking at her for a beat longer than was strictly natural before he looked away at the fire. They talked that evening longer than either of them had probably intended to. Hazel told him about growing up on the Grayson spread, about learning to ride before she was 5 and helping work cattle by the time she was 12, about her father's philosophy that a ranch ran on the effort of everyone who lived and worked on it, and that included his daughter as much as anyone else. She talked about her mother, who had died when Hazel was 11, a fever, quick and cruel, and how it had been just the two of them after that, her and her father, managing a spread that was always just large enough to require everything they had. Oliver talked about Gerald, and about the particular kindness of having an uncle who did not try to turn him into something he was not, but simply gave him room and work and a roof, which was more than enough. He talked about the cattle country of Taos, and the particular silence of night drives when the sky was so full of stars it seemed impossible, and how he had once helped pull a calf in a thunderstorm at 2 in the morning and felt, in that wet and thundering moment, more useful than he had at almost any other point in his life. The fire burned lower and the stars came out, thick and brilliant in the way they only were this far from any town, and they sat in the companionable warmth of having told each other real things. "You never wanted to have your own spread?" Hazel asked. She was sitting with her knees drawn up, arms folded across them, looking at the fire. "I have thought about it," Oliver said. "There is land to be had. The territory is still rough around the edges, but there are homestead claims that can be worked. He stopped, and then decided to say the honest thing. "I never had a good enough reason to stop moving and put roots down somewhere. Not yet." Hazel did not say anything to that, but he could feel her thinking about it, and the silence between them had a particular charged quality that he chose not to examine too closely. In the morning they found the first sign of Prout. It was Oliver who spotted it, a cold fire ring in a sheltered hollow between two rock formations, the ash still fresh enough that it scattered easily in the morning breeze, and the clear impression of 3 horses' hooves in the soft earth near the water seep at the base of the rocks. Hazel crouched down beside the tracks, with the focused concentration of someone who knew what she was looking at. "One of these horses has a cracked right rear shoe," she said, pointing. "That is Prout's horse. I know that mark from the ranch yard." Oliver studied the direction the tracks led. "They are heading toward the Red Canyon Narrows," he said. "There is a way through to the eastern plain, but it takes most of a day to navigate. They are probably a day ahead of us." "Then we keep moving," Hazel said, and was on her feet and moving toward Copper before the words had finished. Oliver stood for a moment looking at her, the set of her shoulders, the quiet, determined line of her jaw, and felt that same shifting thing in his chest that he had felt when she rode into Dusty Creek 2 days ago, but clearer now. He recognized it this time, even if he was not yet sure what to do about it. They pushed hard through the morning, picking up the trail through the Narrows, and it was at the top of a long, rocky climb that they first saw the riders. There were 3 of them, moving along the base of the far canyon wall, still perhaps 2 miles distant. Even at that distance, Oliver could make out the details through the narrowed focus of a man accustomed to reading a landscape, the set of the horses, the loaded packs, the way the lead rider sat his saddle. Hazel had gone very still beside him. "Is that?" Oliver started. "The middle one," she said, her voice absolutely steady in a way that told him it was costing her something. "The man on the brown horse, that is Dale Prout." Oliver watched the 3 figures moving along the canyon floor. "They have not seen us yet. If we come down the south side of this ridge, we can get ahead of them at the canyon mouth where it opens up. We could be waiting when they come through." "There are 3 of them," Hazel said. "There are," Oliver said, "which is why we are going to be smart about this and not charge in." She looked at him. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting we get to that canyon mouth, and when they come through, you let me talk first. If Prout is carrying your father's money, the right thing is to bring him back to face proper justice. Not because he deserves any particular mercy, but because a dead man cannot restore what he took, and you do not want to carry the weight of something that could be handled another way." Hazel was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them. "I want him to answer for what he did," she said finally. "Properly, in front of people who knew my father. Then let us bring him back," Oliver said. They moved fast, taking the south face of the ridge at a pace that was as quick as they dared on the rocky terrain, and reached the canyon mouth with time to spare. Oliver guided them into the cover of a stand of pinon and juniper at the point where the canyon opened into the broader eastern plain, and there they waited. It was perhaps 40 minutes before the sound of horses came echoing through the stone corridor of the canyon. Oliver positioned himself at the edge of the tree cover, hand resting near but not on the pistol at his hip, and Hazel was a breath behind him. The 3 riders came through the canyon mouth and pulled up short when they saw Oliver standing there in the open. Dale Prout was a man of about 40, stocky and sharp-featured, with small pale eyes that swept the scene with quick calculation. The two men with him were younger and harder looking, with the particular watchfulness of men accustomed to expecting trouble. "Afternoon," Oliver said, in the easy conversational tone of a man who is not particularly worried, which was mostly true. "Long ride through those narrows." Pruett's eyes flicked past Oliver and found Hazel, and something moved across his face: recognition, and then a quick suppression of it. "I know you," Hazel said, stepping forward. Her voice was flat and clear and carried without effort. "And you know who I am, and you know why I am here." Pruitt said nothing for a moment, and the two men with him shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their guns with the slow, casual movement of men who were waiting for a signal. "Miss Grayson," Pruitt said finally, his voice carrying a practiced smoothness that had probably served him well for years. "I heard about your father. A terrible thing." "You caused it," she said. "You stole from him and set the fire that killed him, and you are going to ride back to Santa Fe and answer for it." Pruitt looked at her with something cold in his eyes now that the smoothness had not entirely covered. "That is a serious accusation." "I have the ledgers," Hazel said. "My father kept a second set, which you did not know about, because you were not as thorough as you believed yourself to be. I have the records of everything you took, and I have statements from 2 ranch hands who saw your horse tied outside the barn the night it burned. You are going to answer for it." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when a man was doing fast calculation in his head. Oliver had been watching the two riders carefully, and he saw the moment the calculation resolved the slight shift in posture, the specific tightening of the right-hand man's wrist. "That is going to be a poor decision," Oliver said, and his voice had changed entirely from the easy tone of a moment ago. It was quiet and absolutely direct. "Whatever you are thinking right now, it is going to be a poor decision." The right-hand man looked at him. Oliver's hand was no longer near his gun. It was on it. There was another long moment of wind and shadow and the distant sound of a hawk, and then Pruitt raised both hands slowly. "Easy," he said to his men, and the word had a particular deflated quality. Oliver made Pruitt's men ride ahead while he and Hazel flanked Pruitt himself on the 3-day ride back toward Santa Fe, and for those 3 days Oliver did not sleep much at night, keeping careful watch, but Pruitt seemed to have made a pragmatic peace with the situation. A man who had lived by clever manipulation, long enough to recognize when the clever move was to stop fighting. On the second night, while the 2 hired men slept rolled in their blankets a careful distance away, and Pruitt was tied to a juniper tree in a manner that was secure but not cruel, Oliver sat with Hazel by the fire and they talked in low voices about the days ahead. "What will you do?" Oliver asked. "After." Hazel was quiet for a moment. She had been carrying something heavy for 3 months, and the weight of it had become so familiar she was not yet sure what would replace it. "Go back to the ranch," she said. "Try to rebuild. The spread is still mine. My father left it to me clearly in his will, and I have been paying the hands who stayed on to keep things running while I was gone. But it is going to take time and work to bring it back to what it was." "On your own?" he asked. "I'm used to doing things on my own," she said, and it was not said with bitterness, just with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating a plain truth. Oliver looked at the fire. "I know," he said. "I could see that about you from the first moment." She turned to look at him then, and the firelight moved in her eyes, that warm, shifting hazel that changed with every shift in the light. "You are not going to be modest about how quickly you read people," she said, and there was a warmth in it that was definitely teasing. He smiled. "I would not call it modesty exactly. I would call it accurate observation," she laughed softly. "Is that so? You rode into a town you had never been to, went directly to the sheriff, asked your question, and were back on your horse before he could try to talk you out of anything. That is not someone who is uncertain about what she is doing." "I had been uncertain for a long time," she said more quietly. "After my father died, I did not know what to do with it, the grief, the anger. The ranch hands were kind, and the lawyer who handled the estate was kind, and everyone was very sorry. But being sorry does not fix anything. Going and doing something felt like the only way to breathe again." Oliver was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel like you can breathe now?" She considered that seriously, her gaze going to the dark shapes of the canyon walls rising above them. "I think I will," she said, "when it is finished." "It will be finished," he said. "I promise you that." She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted into something unguarded, something open and a little wondering, as if she was seeing something new in him. "Why do you keep doing that?" she said. "Doing what?" "Making promises on my behalf as if they are yours to make." Oliver held her gaze for a moment. "Because they are promises I intend to keep," he said simply, "which makes them mine as much as yours." The thing that happened to her face in that moment, the softening of it, the slight parting of her lips, the quick careful look away, and then back, Oliver stored away in some interior place where he kept the things that mattered. They reached Santa Fe on a warm afternoon in late April, and the delivery of Dale Prout to the county sheriff was a thorough and efficient business. Hazel had her evidence in order, the ledgers, the statements, the clarity of her account, and the sheriff, a methodical man named Harlan Cooper, received it all with the gravity it deserved. The ranch hands who had provided statements were located, and their accounts formally recorded. Prout's two companions were released, having committed no crime beyond riding with him, though both left town with considerable speed, as if relieved to be free of the association. Prout himself was held for trial, and when Hazel walked out of the sheriff's office into the Santa Fe sunshine, she stood for a moment on the boards of the sidewalk with her eyes closed and her face turned up to the warm light. Oliver stood beside her and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. After a moment she opened her eyes. "It does not bring him back," she said. "No," he said. "But it is right," she said. "It is the right thing done, and my father would have wanted that more than anything." "Then you did what needed doing," Oliver said, "and you did it well." She turned and looked at him then, and he saw that her eyes were bright. Not tearful exactly, but bright, as if something long held under pressure had shifted inside her. "Oliver," she said, and his name in her voice had a particular quality that was entirely new. "I do not know what I would have done out there alone. I know I told myself I would have been fine and I probably would have managed, but you would have managed," he said, firmly and sincerely. "You are not a woman who fails to manage." "But I am glad I did not have to," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the Santa Fe sunshine, with the sounds of the town moving around them, horses and voices and the distant clanging of a blacksmith, and said, with the careful honesty that was becoming his particular language when it came to her, "I am glad too." They stayed in Santa Fe for 3 days. Hazel had business to attend to, meeting with her father's lawyer to file the proper documents, checking on the state of the ranch, and communicating with the hands who had maintained it. Oliver found himself useful in the easy way of a man comfortable with practical work, helping where he could, staying out of the way when he was not needed, and generally organizing himself around Hazel's days with a naturalness that surprised them both a little. On the second evening they ate supper at a small restaurant near the plaza, and it was the first time in weeks that either of them had sat at a proper table with proper food and had nowhere to be and nothing urgently pressing on the immediate moment. There was a particular strange sweetness to that, the feeling of open time, unhurried and spacious. They talked for 3 hours without noticing the time pass, and the subjects ranged widely: books they had read, places they had been, what they each thought about various things, from the nature of justice to the best method for curing leather to the particular beauty of New Mexico in the hour before dawn, which they both turned out to feel strongly about. There were moments when they disagreed, and those turned out to be interesting rather than contentious, because Hazel argued with intelligence and a quality of genuine engagement that Oliver found enormously appealing, and he suspected she felt the same about him. When the restaurant began dimming its lamps in the polite suggestion that the evening was concluded, they walked back through the plaza in the warm spring night, and Oliver, without planning it or thinking about it, offered her his arm. She took it, without hesitation or comment, with the naturalness of something that simply made sense. They walked through the plaza in a comfortable silence that felt almost like music. At the door of the boarding house where they had taken separate rooms, Hazel paused. The lamplight from inside the window fell across her face, warm and gold. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to tell me honestly what you think, not what you think I want to hear." "I have been fairly consistently honest with you," he said. "You have," she agreed. "That is why I am asking." She paused. "What are you going to do when we are done here, when we go back? I know you have your work with Gerald and that is your life, and I am not asking you to promise me anything. But I am asking what you are thinking, because I would like to know." Oliver was quiet for a moment. He could have said something careful and non-committal. He chose not to. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "that I have not had a good reason to stop moving and put down roots somewhere. And I am thinking that in the last week that particular situation has changed and I would be a fool not to acknowledge it." She searched his face. "That is not nothing to say," she said quietly. "No," he said, "it is not, but I meant it and I thought you should have it honestly." She was quiet for a long moment, and he let her think whatever she needed to think without trying to fill the space. Then she said, "My father's ranch is outside of Santa Fe. It is a good piece of land and it is struggling right now, and I intend to rebuild it. It is going to require a great deal of work." A pause. "I would not be opposed to a partner in that." "A partner," he said. "Yes," she said, and there was the ghost of that smile again. "That is what I said." He looked at her for a moment. "I would not be opposed to that either," he said very seriously. She held his gaze, and the smile came fully then, that luminous open thing that changed her whole face. And she said good night and went inside. And Oliver stood in the Santa Fe night for a long time before going in himself, looking up at a sky full of stars, and feeling the particular arrested wonder of a man who has just been offered something he did not know how badly he wanted until the moment it was offered. The Grayson spread was 12 miles southeast of Santa Fe, set in a valley where the land rolled gently, and a good creek ran through the western edge of the property. The house was solid adobe, pale and warm-colored, with a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains. The barn had been rebuilt by the hands after the fire, not as large as the original, but sound, and the corrals were in decent shape. The cattle had been reduced from what they had been, but a core of good stock remained, tended by 4 ranch hands who had stayed on out of loyalty to the Grayson name. The oldest of these was a man named Beto Salazar, who was perhaps 60, with a magnificent gray mustache and an economy of expression that suggested a man who had said everything he needed to say several decades ago, and was content to let the world do the talking now. He looked Oliver over with the careful assessment of a man who had watched many cowboys come and go on this particular piece of land, and Oliver held that look with the patient steadiness of a man with nothing to hide, and after a moment Beto gave a single nod that seemed to signify something important. "He knows cattle," Beto told Hazel that evening, in a tone that suggested this was higher praise than it might initially seem. "I thought he might," Hazel said, with a glance at Oliver that was warm and private. Oliver settled into the work of the ranch with a thoroughness that left no room for doubt about his intentions. He was up before dawn every day, worked alongside the hands without distinction, made decisions when called upon to make them with the kind of quiet assurance that came from genuine knowledge, and deferred to Hazel on matters of the ranch's direction and philosophy with a consistency that told everyone watching that he understood whose ranch this was. Which was not nothing, in 1874. There were plenty of men who would have walked onto a woman's property with the intention of managing it, or eventually owning it, rather than serving it. Oliver was not that man, and the hands figured that out within a week, and the particular quality of relaxation that moved through the crew told Hazel everything she needed to know about how well he fit. He and Hazel worked alongside each other through those spring weeks, and the business of the ranch, which was constant and demanding, and left very little room for anything that was not directly productive, turned out to be extraordinarily good conditions for two people to come to know each other. You learned who someone was when you worked beside them through hard things. You learned what they were like when they were tired, when something went wrong, when a decision had to be made quickly. You learned whether they treated people with dignity and whether they said what they meant. Oliver and Hazel learned these things about each other at the rate of people who were around each other most of every day, and what they learned was consistently and surprisingly pleasing to both of them. There was an evening in late May, the sun going down enormous and vermilion behind the mountains, the air cooling into that perfect warm and cool mixture that New Mexico evenings did so well. When they were sitting on the porch after supper, and Hazel was reading a letter from a cousin in Albuquerque, and Oliver was looking at the mountains, and neither of them was talking, and Oliver realized that he had never in his life felt this particular kind of peaceful in another person's company. There had been women he had been attracted to, and women he had liked spending time with, but he had never felt simply at rest with someone, the way you could be at rest with the landscape itself, needing nothing from it, content just to be in it. Hazel looked up from her letter and found him looking at the mountains. She looked at his face for a moment, the quiet line of it, the particular settled quality in his eyes, and then looked back at her letter, but she was smiling as she read. The trial of Dale Pruitt happened in June, and Hazel and Oliver rode back to Santa Fe together to attend it. The proceedings took 2 days, and Hazel testified with the composed clarity of someone who had been carrying this story for months and knew exactly how it needed to be told. The jury took less than an hour. Pruitt was convicted of theft and arson with resulting death, and sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison. It was not enough, and it was something, and Hazel held both of those things at once as they rode back to the ranch that evening, and Oliver rode beside her without speaking much, just present, just there. Somewhere on the open road south of Santa Fe, with the mountains going purple and the first stars appearing, Hazel reached across the space between their horses and took Oliver's hand. He looked over at her. "Thank you," she said, and it was the simplest, most complete thing she had said to him yet. He turned his hand and held hers properly, warm and deliberate. "You did that," he said, "every part of it." "We did it," she said, with a firmness that invited no argument. He smiled and held her hand, and they rode the rest of the way home in the falling dark. The summer moved forward with the particular momentum of a ranch in a good season. The cattle were healthy, the grass was holding, and Oliver and Beteau between them managed to work out a grazing rotation that was notably better than the previous arrangement, which Beteau acknowledged by simply implementing it without comment, which Oliver had come to understand was the highest form of approval in Beteau's personal lexicon. There was a new hand that arrived in July, a young man of 20 named Jesse Cruz, the son of a neighboring rancher, who had come looking for work with the Grayson spread because his father's land was between Situations and Oliver, and Hazel both liked him immediately. He was earnest and willing and good with horses in a way that showed real affinity rather than just training. The ranch was filling back out, slowly and steadily, and Hazel watched this with a quiet satisfaction that was also touched by something that was not entirely peace. It was her father's ranch, rebuilt, and every improvement was a conversation with a man who was not there to see it. Oliver noticed when those moments came over her. He noticed the particular quality of stillness, the brief distance in her eyes. He did not intrude on it, but he found ways to be near it, bringing coffee, or leaning against the fence rail beside her, or simply adjusting his position so that she was not alone with whatever she was sitting with. It was the kind of attention that did not call attention to itself, and Hazel was aware of it in a way that moved through her like warmth. One afternoon in late July, when the heat was enormous and the work of the afternoon had collapsed into the still hour after midday, Hazel found Oliver sitting in the shade of the barn with a copy of a novel. She was close enough before she realized he was there to see that it was a well-read copy of something by Washington Irving, the spine repaired with a careful application of glue that told her it had been read a great many times. "I did not know you carried books," she said, sitting down beside him with her back against the barn wall. He looked up with a small, self-conscious quality that she found entirely charming. "I have two," he said, with a slight air of a man confessing to something modest. "Which two?" "This one and a collection of essays by Emerson. My mother gave me the Irving when I was 12. The Emerson I found in the saddlebag of a horse I bought in Taos, and I have never been entirely sure it belongs to me, but the horse's previous owner was thoroughly gone, so—" Hazel laughed, a real full laugh. "Oliver Barlow, possibly in possession of stolen essays." "Possibly," he agreed. "Though I prefer to think of myself as a steward." She leaned her head back against the barn wall and looked at the sky beyond the overhang. "My father had books. We had a whole shelf of them. Most of them survived the fire because they were in the house, not the barn. They are still there on the shelf." "Have you read them?" "Many times. My father and I used to read aloud to each other in the evenings. He liked history mainly, anything about exploration or natural history. He had a particular enthusiasm for Lewis and Clark." Oliver turned his head to look at her. She was looking at the sky with that particular expression, the weight in it, the love in it. "He sounds like a remarkable man," he said. "He was," she said simply. "The best person I have ever known." She paused. "He would have liked you, I think." Oliver was quiet for a moment, and then said, with careful honesty, "That means more to me than I can easily say." She turned her head to look at him then, and they were quite close, the barn wall and the narrow shade, and the heat of the afternoon having arranged them thus. And the look between them had a particular quality that was no longer deniable for either of them. It had been building for weeks, this feeling, or perhaps it had been there from the very first day and had simply been getting louder. And in the heat and quiet of the July afternoon, it was entirely apparent in both their faces. "Hazel," he said. "Yes," she said, before he could say anything else, and there was a small laughing quality to it that was also perfectly serious. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so simple and so careful that it was its own kind of eloquence, and then kissed her softly, and she kissed him back with a warmth and directness that was entirely consistent with everything he had come to know about her. When they separated, they stayed close, and Oliver looked at her with those dark, honest eyes and said, "I have been wanting to do that for quite some time." "I know," she said. "I have been wondering when you were going to get around to it." He laughed, startled and warm, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat there in the barn shade with the summer pressing heat into everything, and the ranch quiet around them in the long, still afternoon, and something that had been coming for months arrived completely. The shift that happened in their life on the ranch after that was less a change than a clarification. They were still working alongside each other from dawn forward, still making the 100 daily decisions that a working ranch required, still sitting on the porch in the evenings with Beto sometimes and sometimes alone, still talking about everything from cattle prices to philosophy to the way the light changed on the mountains at different hours of the day. But now there was an openness between them that had not been there before, a directness of feeling, acknowledged and mutual, that made everything sharper and more vivid. Oliver made his intentions clear to Hazel in August, standing in the kitchen of the adobe house with flour on his hands because he had been learning to make biscuits from Consuelo, the Mexican woman from the nearby village who came twice a week to cook for the ranch, and Consuelo was watching from the corner with a very satisfied expression. "I would like to marry you," Oliver said to Hazel, who had walked in to find this scene in progress. "I am aware that I am not presenting this in the most dignified way possible, given the flower situation." Hazel looked at the flower and at Consuelo's barely contained delight and then at Oliver and said, "Yes," with a directness that made Consuelo clap her hands once in a short, sharp expression of triumph. "Was that a yes?" Oliver said, as if he wanted to be certain. "Oliver," Hazel said, "when have I ever said a thing I did not mean?" He looked at her for a moment, and then crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his floury hands and kissed her properly. And Consuelo was definitely not crying. She was just having a reaction to the flower dust. They were married in September of 1874, in the small church in the village 3 miles from the ranch, in a ceremony that was not large, but was full of people who meant something. Beto Salazar stood up with Oliver as his witness, which seemed to surprise some people and not others. Gerald Barlow came down from Dusty Creek, arriving 2 days early and spending both days making himself generally useful in a way that expressed a great deal more than words. Jesse Cruz brought wildflowers from the hills, bundled with more care than you might expect from a 20-year-old ranch hand. The ceremony was conducted by a padre from the village who had a lovely voice and a thoughtful way with the words of the rite, and Oliver and Hazel stood before him in the cool stone interior of the small church, and said what they meant to each other, with the same quality of honesty that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. Oliver had said, in the privacy of the morning before the ceremony, that he wanted her to know something clearly, that he was not coming into this marriage with any idea of taking over the Grayson Ranch or subsuming its identity into something else. It was her father's land and her land, and he considered himself a partner in the true sense, which meant the ranch would always be what she wanted it to be, and he would work in service of that vision, not in opposition to it. Hazel had looked at him for a long moment when he said that, and then said, "It is our ranch," with a firmness that was also tenderness. "As of today, it is our ranch, and I will not have you treating it as otherwise." He had nodded and taken her hand, and that had been the actual ceremony as far as he was concerned, though the padre's version was also very nice. They danced that evening at the ranch, a gathering with music from the village, fiddles and a guitar, and the stars over the desert blazing as they did. And Oliver danced with his wife on the packed earth of the ranch yard with the mountains dark against the sky and the lamplight spilling golden through the windows of the adobe house. And he thought, with a clarity that was almost startling, that he had never in his life been so completely in the right place. The autumn and winter of that year were spent in the very full occupation of building a life together, which was harder and better than most accounts of it would lead you to believe. There was the constant work of the ranch, which did not pause for sentiment. There were decisions to be made about the cattle operation, about expanding the breeding program, about the fencing on the east pasture that needed to be redone before the spring calving. There were evenings when they were both too tired to do much besides sit together on the porch with coffee, and there were evenings when they talked until midnight about everything and nothing, and there were mornings when something small went wrong, and they navigated it with the imperfect grace of two people who were genuinely trying. Oliver discovered in those months things about Hazel that he had not yet known, that she was a formidable chess player, having learned the game from her father, and that she played it with a strategic patience that was slightly frightening, that she sang quietly to herself when she worked alone, mostly old folk songs she had known since childhood, in a voice that was not trained but was true and warm, that she was funny genuinely, dryly funny in a way that crept up on you and caught you off guard, that she had a particular stubbornness about certain things, and that this stubbornness was occasionally maddening, and also one of the things he loved most about her, because it was inseparable from the strength that ran through her like a spine. Hazel discovered things about Oliver, too, that he had a very specific reverence for animals, treating the horses and the cattle with a consistent gentleness that was not soft but was deeply respectful, that he was better at forgiving himself for small mistakes than for large ones, and that this occasionally required some external assistance, that he had a tendency to stay up late doing extra work rather than admit he was struggling with something, and that this required a particular kind of attention to spot before it became a problem, that he laughed more easily than she did, and that his laugh, which was real and startled and full, could sometimes rearrange a whole difficult day into something manageable. They learned each other the way you learn land you intend to live on carefully, thoroughly, with the understanding that there are always more things to find. The letter arrived from Kansas in February of 1875, which was Oliver's history arriving with the particular thoroughness of things long postponed. It was from a distant cousin he had not been in contact with for years, informing him that his parents' original homestead, 40 acres outside of a small Kansas town, was in probate proceedings since the cousin who had been living on it had died without heirs, and that Oliver, as the only surviving relative, had a legal claim to it. He showed the letter to Hazel without comment and watched her read it. "What do you want to do?" she asked, looking up. "I do not want to leave the ranch," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that, but it is my parents' land. I have not seen it since I was 15 years old." Hazel looked at the letter again and then at him. "We could ride up in the spring," she said. "After the calving is done and the ranch is steady, see it, make a decision about it from that." "You would do that, make that trip?" She looked at him with an expression that was both surprised and slightly exasperated. "Oliver, you are my husband. Of course I would make that trip." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was quietly overwhelmed and then nodded. "After the calving," he said. The calving season came and went with the usual drama and exhaustion, several difficult births, one loss that was genuinely sad, and several successes that were genuinely wonderful, including a set of twin calves that arrived on a cold March night while Oliver and Hazel were both in the barn, covered in hay and completely tired, and looked at each other across the warm, breathing shapes of the new animals with an expression that was pure and uncomplicated joy. "Two," Oliver said, in a wondering tone. "Two," Hazel confirmed and leaned against him, and they stood together in the lamplight and the warm animal smell of the barn and were simply, completely happy. In April, Hazel told him something in the way that you tell the most important thing. She said it in the kitchen, in the morning, with the straightforward calm of a woman who had thought carefully about how to say it and had settled on simply saying it plainly. "We are going to have a child," she said. Oliver set down the cup he was holding with a care that was slightly excessive, and then stood there for a moment in the kitchen in a state that could only be described as complete arrested wonder. Then he crossed the room and took her in his arms, and held her with a thoroughness that communicated everything that words would have required too much time to say. Against his shoulder, Hazel laughed softly. "You are holding me as if something might blow away," she said. "Nothing is going to blow away," he said firmly into her hair. She held him back. "Nothing is going to blow away," she agreed. They wrote to Gerald, who wrote back with the uncharacteristic expressiveness of a man who was very moved and chose to express this by writing 4 pages about how well the store was doing, a clear case of emotion finding indirect roots. Beteau received the news with a silence so profound it constituted a response, and then went and painted the fence of the near corral a better color, which was Beteau's way of celebrating. Consuelo wept with open joy and immediately began a campaign of feeding Hazel everything she considered appropriately nutritious, which Oliver supported entirely, and Hazel endured with the grace of someone who recognized love in its various forms. The trip to Kansas happened in May, when the ranch was in its capable, steady hands, and the spring season had tipped into that good, warm period before the heat. Oliver and Hazel rode north through land that grew flatter and wider and greener, into the rolling grass country of Kansas, which was a different world from New Mexico, moister, greener, softer in its lines, with enormous skies that went from one horizon to the other in an unbroken arc. The homestead was 40 acres of mixed grass and small timber along a creek, with the remains of the original house still standing partially collapsed, weathered to silver but recognizable. Oliver stood in the yard of it for a long time without speaking, and Hazel stood beside him and let him have whatever he needed to have. "I used to think the creek was enormous," he said finally. "I remember thinking you could get lost in the woods on the south side of it. It looked like a whole wilderness from here." Hazel looked at the woods, modest and green and real. "It is a good creek," she said. "It is," he said. He turned and looked at the collapsed house, the outline of the old garden, the stone of the well that was still intact. He stood there with the history of himself arranged around him in the afternoon light, and then he turned to Hazel. "It is a good piece of land," he said, "but it is not where I belong anymore." "No," she said. "No," he said. "I belong in New Mexico, with you, with the ranch," a pause, "with whatever is coming in November." Hazel put her hand on her stomach. It was beginning to show, gently, just beginning. "With whoever is coming in November," she corrected. He smiled at her. "With whoever," he agreed. They made the necessary arrangements with the county office in the nearest town. The property went to a young couple who were homesteading in the area and needed the land, sold at a fair price that would go toward improvements at the Grayson Ranch. Oliver kept a single stone from the well to take home, and a piece of timber from the doorframe of the old house, and that was the whole of it. The past carried forward in small pieces, fitted into the present. On the ride home, south through Kansas and into the territory again, Hazel said to him on the second evening with the firelight playing on both their faces, "Are you all right? Really? Really," he said. "I am better than all right." It was good to go. I needed to see it to know what I was carrying and what I could put down. And now I know, and what I am carrying going forward is lighter. She nodded. She understood exactly what he meant in the way of someone who had done a version of that same thing herself. "I want to ask you something," Oliver said. "Ask it. Your father's ranch. I know we agreed it is our ranch, but I want to know what you think about keeping the Grayson name for it, not the Barlow name." The Grayson name. Hazel looked at him for a long moment in the firelight. "Why are you offering that?" "Because it is your father's work as much as yours. His name is in the land. And I did not build it, I came into it. It should carry his name." She was quiet for a very long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and full. "The Grayson Ranch," she said. "Yes, that is right. That is what it should be." She looked at him. "But you know that your name is in it now too. Everything you have built there, everything you have put into it, that is yours as much as mine." "I know," he said. "I just wanted the name to be right." She reached over and took his hand across the firelight and held it, and they sat like that for a long time in the warm Kansas night, and the stars came out over the flat land in their multitudes, and everything that needed to be settled between them felt settled, not finally, in the way that life was sometimes finished and closed, but in the way that a foundation was settled, solid and true, and built to last. They were back at the ranch in June, and the summer moved forward with the fullness of a life being actively lived. Hazel's pregnancy was uncomplicated, managed with the practical calm of a woman who took care of herself and trusted her own body, and Oliver was attentive without being overbearing. A balance she appreciated enormously and told him so clearly. There was a difficulty in late August when one of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Gerald Hawthorne, no relation to Oliver's uncle, began pressuring Hazel about the eastern boundary of the property. Hawthorne was a man of considerable land and a notable confidence in his right to more of it, and he had apparently decided, perhaps because of Hazel's father's death and the reduced state of the ranch in the year following it, that the Grayson eastern boundary was subject to renegotiation. He arrived at the ranch one afternoon with two of his cowboys, and a surveyor's map that Oliver could see at a glance had been drawn with the particular ambitious creativity of a man who needed the lines to be somewhere other than where they actually were. Hazel met him on the porch with the deed to the property in her hand, which she had retrieved from the house with a calmness that said she had anticipated something like this might eventually arrive. Oliver stood beside her, and Beto stood at the edge of the porch, and Jesse Cruz happened to be working near the corral and happened to be within easy distance of the conversation. "The Grayson deed," Hazel said, holding it out. "Filed in 1861 with the county office in Santa Fe. The eastern boundary runs along the Cedar Ridge, which I believe you will find is clearly marked by the survey stakes my father put down 12 years ago, and which are still standing." Hawthorne looked at the deed and then at Hazel, and then at Oliver, and made the particular calculation of a man figuring out whether the ground under his argument was as solid as he had believed it to be. "Those stakes may have shifted," he tried. "Those stakes are embedded in rock," Hazel said pleasantly. "I would be glad to ride out to the boundary with you and your surveyor and compare your map to the deed. I think you will find that the county record is fairly definitive." The surveyor, to his credit, looked as if he would prefer to be somewhere else entirely, and was examining the Grayson deed with the expression of a professional who was beginning to have doubts about this commission. Hawthorne tried one or two more approaches, which Hazel met with the same pleasantness and the same precise clarity, and after 20 minutes he gathered his map and his men and left, with the deflated bearing of someone who had ridden in hoping for an easy advantage and found something rather harder. After the horses had gone, Oliver said, "You were magnificent." "I had my father's deed," Hazel said. "You also had the particular tone of voice that makes strong men reconsider their life choices," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Is that a compliment?" "Enthusiastically," he said. She laughed, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they watched the afternoon settle back into its ordinary rhythms, and Beteau went back to his fence, and Jesse resumed whatever he had been doing at the corral, and the Grayson ranch breathed easily under the late summer sky. The baby arrived in November. It was a cold, clear night with the stars brilliant and the mountains dark, and the birth was attended by the midwife from the village, a woman of 60 named Rosaria, who had delivered every child in a 3-mile radius for decades, and had an air about her of someone who had seen everything twice. Oliver was not in the room for the birth itself, which was the custom, but he was very close to the door and did not sleep and moved between the front porch and the hallway with the particular pacing energy of a man whose composure was entirely theoretical. Beteau sat with him for most of the night, saying nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. When Rosaria came out and said, with a tired and satisfied smile, "A boy, healthy. Good voice on him," Oliver's composure went entirely, and he stood in the hallway with his hand over his face for a moment before pulling himself together and going in. Hazel was sitting up against the pillows, pale and warm, with a look on her face that Oliver had never seen before, and that rendered everything he had ever thought of as beauty into a pale preliminary version of itself. The baby was in her arms, wrapped in the white blanket that Consuelo had been making since April, and was a very red, very emphatic small person with a quality of determination already visible in the set of his tiny features. Oliver sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, and did not say anything because there were no words for what this was. Hazel looked up at him. "Come here," she said quietly. He leaned in and she shifted the baby into his arms with a careful confidence, and Oliver held his son for the first time the warm, astonishing weight of him, the closed eyes and the small working fist, and felt something open in him so wide and deep it was like the landscape itself, going on and on without a visible end. "Edward," Hazel said. "I would like to call him Edward." Oliver looked at her over the baby. "After your father," he said. "Yes." "Yes," he said. "Of course, yes." She reached up and touched his face, and he bent down and kissed her forehead, and the baby made a small, decisive sound between them. The spring of 1876 brought changes to the wider world and a steady deepening of the life on the Grayson ranch. Edward Grayson Barlow was, by all accounts, a person of strong opinions even at 5 months old, and he expressed these opinions with a volume and clarity that left no room for ambiguity. He liked horses. The first time Oliver brought him to the corral and held him up so he could see the animals properly, the baby went entirely still and fixed the nearest horse with a look of absolute focused fascination that made Oliver laugh and made Hazel say, with a knowing quality, "He is exactly like my father." The ranch had expanded its cattle operation in the previous season's work, and they had brought on 2 more hands, a quietly competent woman named Maria, who did the work of 2 men, with the efficiency of someone who had always had to be better than average to be considered sufficient, and an older man named Tom Watts who had 30 years of cattle experience, and the patience of someone who had made peace with the unpredictability of everything. The ranch was becoming what Hazel had always imagined it could be, not oversized or overstretched, but solid and productive, and run with genuine care for the land and the animals and the people on it. Oliver had, over the months, quietly changed things in ways that improved the operation without changing its fundamental character, redesigning the water management to make better use of the creek in dry months, adjusting the grazing patterns to let the grass recover in the east pasture, building a proper cold storage facility that Consuelo had been requesting for 2 years with the polite persistence of someone who knows she is right. Each of these things was done in consultation with Hazel, and often with Beto, and the result was something that felt evolved rather than changed. Hazel watched the ranch and Oliver both with the particular attention of someone who had reason to notice, and what she saw was a man growing into a life that fit him the way good work fits a person who was built for it. There were difficult things too. A wet spring that brought disease through part of the herd and required 3 hard weeks of intensive care, during which Oliver and Beto and Maria were out at all hours, and Hazel managed the household and the accounts and the logistics of what the ranch needed, while also managing a crawling infant who had discovered that everything at floor level was very interesting. There was a dry patch in midsummer that threatened the south pasture and required a renegotiation of the grazing plan, and some very tense weeks before the rains came. There was a dispute with the county assessor about the ranch's water rights that required a trip to Santa Fe and several weeks of correspondence, which Hazel handled with the methodical persistence of someone who had learned that bureaucratic problems responded to thoroughness the way most problems did. Through all of it, they held together with the particular solidity of people who had tested themselves before they had been tested by ordinary life and knew what they were made of. One evening in late summer of 1876, they were sitting on the porch after supper, Edward asleep inside, the mountains going dark against a sky that had gone from gold to rose to the deep soft blue of falling night. Hazel was mending a piece of gear. She always had something useful in her hands in the evenings, and Oliver was simply sitting, looking at the land. "Are you happy?" Hazel asked without looking up from her work. Oliver looked at her. "That is a question that deserves a real answer," he said. "I am asking for a real answer." He thought about it for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to say it properly. "I am happy," he said. "In a way I did not know was possible before this. I thought happiness was a particular feeling, excitement or relief or getting what you wanted. But this is different. This is just," he paused, "being exactly where you are, with no part of you wishing you were somewhere else. I did not know that was what it was supposed to feel like." Hazel set down her work and looked at him. The last light was in her eyes, warm and shifting, and she was so much herself, so entirely, completely herself, that looking at her was like looking at something true in a world full of approximations. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is exactly what it is." He reached out and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the blue falling dark with the mountains and the stars and the warm, quiet breathing of the ranch all around them. "My father used to say that a good life was a simple thing built carefully," Hazel said. "I did not understand it when I was young. I thought a good life had to be complicated to be worth having, but he was right." "He was," Oliver said. "He was right about a lot of things." She squeezed his hand. "He would have been proud of this," she said. "The ranch, you, all of it." "I hope so," Oliver said. "I intend to keep giving him reasons." Inside, Edward made a small exploratory sound, not quite crying, just announcing himself, and Hazel rose to go to him. And Oliver watched her go through the lit doorway of their house with a feeling that was so large it had no name, only a quality, like the quality of the mountains at morning or the sky after a storm. The years moved forward with the particular rhythm of a working life full of seasons, full of work, full of small and large moments that together made up something substantial. In 1878, they had a second child, another boy, born in July with the same decisive quality as his older brother, named Thomas for the simple reason that he looked, as Hazel said with a tired and wonderful certainty in the hour after his birth, like a Thomas. Edward, by this point 3 years old and deeply interested in everything, received the news of a brother with the philosophical gravity of someone who has had a long time to think about change and has decided to be pragmatic about it. The ranch continued to grow and to steady itself. Jesse Cruz became the foreman at 23, which he wore with the slightly astonished pride of someone who had not entirely expected to earn something so significant. Beto Salazar retired from active work at 64, but remained on the property in a semi-official capacity of what he himself described as supervision, which everyone understood to mean that he sat on the porch and watched the work, and occasionally made a comment that contained more useful information than a lecture. Oliver rode down to Dusty Creek every few months to visit his Uncle Gerald, sometimes with Hazel and the boys, sometimes alone for shorter trips, and Gerald came up to the ranch for the Christmas season each year, filling the adobe house with his large, quiet presence and the particular contentment of a man who had lived without his nearest family for too long and was making up for it. In 1879, a woman named Ann Whitfield came to the ranch looking for work. She was 30, a widow, with a quality of tired resourcefulness that Hazel recognized immediately. She was taken on as a second cook and household manager, which was a title that covered a range of things, and she had a practical warmth and an easy competence that made her valuable within the first week. Oliver noticed, with the patient attention of someone who had learned to notice what mattered, that Beto Salazar had developed a habit of finding reasons to be near the house at the hours when Ann Whitfield was most likely to be outside. He did not say anything about this to anyone except Hazel, in the private amusement of their shared evenings, and Hazel watched the developing situation with the fond attention of someone who believed in love in all its various forms and timeframes. Beto and Ann were married in the spring of 1880 in the same small church where Oliver and Hazel had been married, and the celebration afterward was a large and genuine thing, with music and food and the specific joy of a community that was genuinely glad for the people in it. Oliver and Hazel danced that evening, as they had at their own wedding 6 years earlier, and Oliver was aware, as he had become aware of many things in the years of being married to this woman, that it was a different dance now, not less but more, deepened by everything between them. "Do you remember," Hazel said as they turned in the lamplight, "that you described yourself as a guide when you first offered to come with me?" "A very practical framing," he said. "You were terrified of saying anything real," she said with a warmth that was teasing and tender. "I was trying to be useful," he said with dignity. "You were," she said. "You were very useful. You were also entirely obvious even then." "I was not obvious," he said. She raised one eyebrow. "I was," he stopped. "Fine. I was slightly obvious." She laughed against his shoulder, and he held her as they danced, and the music went on, and the stars were very bright over the canyon country of New Mexico. There is a particular quality of autumn evening in the high desert that exists nowhere else. The air gone cool and transparent, the light golden and low, the smell of piñon smoke beginning, and the mountains going from purple to dark blue in the hour before full dark. In October of 1881, Oliver and Hazel sat on the porch of the adobe house as they had sat on hundreds of evenings before, and watched that light move over the land. Edward was 7 now, and Thomas was 3, and both of them were inside with the small chaos of children at the end of the day. Hazel was expecting their third child in the spring. This time, she said with the particular knowing quality she had developed, a girl. "You cannot know that," Oliver said, not for the first time. "I know," Hazel said, with the absolute serenity of someone who does know. He had stopped arguing the point. The ranch was in its best shape, yet healthy cattle, good land, a crew that was skilled and loyal and treated with fairness and genuine regard. The water management that Oliver had worked on for years had proven itself through 2 dry summers. The Grayson name on the gate at the end of the drive meant something in the territory now, not just the name of a man who had built something good, but the name of something continuing and alive. "I have been thinking," Hazel said, "about what my father said. About a good life being a simple thing built carefully." "What about it?" Oliver asked. "I think he was almost right," she said, "but I think a good life is also a shared thing, built carefully, yes, but not alone." Oliver looked at her in the amber evening light, the woman who had ridden into a town with a loaded pistol and a broken heart and a clarity of purpose that had changed both their lives, and felt what he always felt when he looked at her, which was a love so thorough and specific that it had its own particular quality, like a particular landscape or a particular hour of the day. "You are right," he said. He was almost right. "You are exactly right." She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the evening fell over the land in its beautiful, slow way, and the lights came on in the ranch yard, and the smell of supper came through the door, and the voices of the boys carried from inside, and it was the sound of everything they had built together, not by plan but by choice, not by luck but by the decision made over and over to show up for each other and for this life. The spring of 1882 brought the 3rd child, and she was, as her mother had known with perfect certainty, a girl. She arrived on a warm April morning when the apple tree in the yard behind the house was in bloom, and she was named Clara, not after anyone in particular, but simply because the name was right for her, clear and bright and true. Oliver held Clara the first time with the same arrested wonder he had felt with each of them, and was not surprised to find that wonder had not diminished with repetition, but had rather deepened, the way anything deepens when you have given it your full attention over time. Hazel watched him with their daughter and felt a complicated happiness, the grief of her father still present in her, as it would always be present, woven into the fabric of who she was, but transformed now into something that was more gratitude than loss, because everything good in her life had grown from the roots he had planted. The ranch was his legacy. Her strength was his gift. And the man holding their daughter was the unexpected miracle she had not known to ask for and had been given anyway. "She has your eyes," Oliver said to Hazel. Hazel looked at Clara's small face, the eyes that were already showing the warm, shifting Hazel that had named a town and caught a man's attention in an amber-lit street 7 years ago. "She does," she said. "Then she is going to be extraordinary," Oliver said simply, looking from his daughter to his wife. Hazel reached up and touched his face, as she had in the same house, on the night Edward was born, and Oliver leaned down and kissed her forehead, and Clara made a small sound between them, and outside the window the apple tree was in bloom, and the New Mexico morning was going gold and wide, and the mountains stood in their patient, unchanging presence against the sky. The Grayson ranch went on. The children grew. The land was tended with care. The seasons came in their order and were met with the readiness of people who understood that life required both hard work and the willingness to receive what it offered with open hands. And on the long evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled, and the stars came out over the desert in their impossible abundance, Oliver and Hazel Barlow sat together on the porch of the house that had been built by her father and rebuilt by their life together, and were simply there, 2 people who had found each other in a dusty street in 1874 and had built something real and lasting from the particular, unlikely material of their meeting. A love that had started with grief and a loaded pistol, and a man with sawdust on his boots and something shifting in his chest had become this, a house with light in the windows, a name on the gate, the sound of children and the smell of coffee and the mountains in the evening, going on and on. It was, as Edward Grayson had known and his daughter had come to know, a simple thing built carefully. It was the best thing either of them had ever done.